Well, hello again, and welcome to another episode of Sermon B-Sides. My name is Rustin. I'm one of the pastors here at Coram Deo Church, and I'm here with Pastor John.
Cheers.
Cheers. How you doing, John?
I'm good. I'm going to somebody's house putting up Christmas lights for him tonight.
I saw your phone buzzing with the big header saying lights.
Lights tonight, yeah.
You know, there's that. You ever watched that movie Stargate?
I have not watched Stargate.
Okay, so Stargate starts with this scene where this archaeologist is like uncovering some hieroglyphics in some pyramid.
Yeah.
And there's this kid, it's like gotta be like in the 40s or something, and there's this kid they don't have like lamps and flashlights or anything. There's a kid standing in the hallway where the light's coming in, and he's shining a mirror so that the guy, like the light goes against this wall where he's decoding the hieroglyphics. And the man is like, the kid's getting so tired, he's like falling asleep, and so the light's falling off the thing. And he always says, "Aziz, light." Oh, that's the kid's name. So whenever I see light, I always think,
That's what you think.
Aziz, light. Like
Wow.
that. You're welcome
Now
for that. Now you know. Speaking of light,
yeah.
We're in Colossians chapter 3, and we're in the lovely chapter.
Yes.
And section specifically on husband and wife.
Husband, wife,
and servants.
parents, kids, servants, masters.
Yes. So
Yes.
So should we just this is the episode and the topic that I'm sure will offend so many people, right?
I don't know.
Maybe.
Just don't offend God. Everyone
Yeah,
else is
exactly.
okay.
Exactly. That's the key thing. So, what is he? When you're preaching a sermon like this,
Yeah.
you're preaching into a context that hates certain words.
Yes.
Okay, submit in particular.
Yeah. Well, yeah. It depends.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, true. I mean, but in general,
if the governor tells you something, then people are all for it.
yes, really weird.
Yeah.
Really weird how there's a strange combination of things that happen where the people who tend to hate this idea of the relationship of husband and wife. God has made it such that the woman's role is submissive to her husband, and the husband's role is loving responsibility.
Yeah.
And that language is like, ugh, don't say that,
Yep.
don't submit. But then when the government says something, don't leave your house for, who knows how long, no end in sight. And there's half the people who are saying that they don't like this language, or like, no, you must submit, right? Something weird is going on there.
I not to belabor the point, but I'm going to do it. Well, I remember just thinking, like, if people respected and submitted to their church leaders the way they did to the political leaders, churches would be different.
Yeah.
Like in a positive sense.
But you bring up, so B-Sides is for rabbit trails. That's what it's for.
It is.
So this is a really,
It is.
let's just talk a little bit about.
And let's get to marriage then.
Okay.
After this.
Okay, we'll get to marriage. We will get to marriage, but let's just talk a little bit about the deterioration of authority structures. Okay?
Yeah.
So,
that goes back to Genesis 3, right?
Yep.
The lie that Satan tells Eve is right. Satan, his goal is to distract you from the truth. Right? He wants to deceive you.
Yep.
Right, and he doesn't care necessarily how that works.
Yep.
So the ploy is to undo the authority of God, which was expressed and exercised through him speaking to Adam.
Yep.
Right? And so Satan wants to undo that authority.
Yep.
Right? That's what you're getting at. Like,
Yes.
always.
He wants to undo that authority, but notice that he does it in two different. In Genesis 3, he does it in two different ways. Okay, the first way is by subverting the message. God said this. Did he really say?
Yep.
Right. The second way is by subverting the authority structures God has put in place.
Yeah. He didn't talk to Adam.
He didn't talk to Adam. He talked to Eve.
Yeah.
He deceived Eve, and he put Eve in the driver's seat of this conversation, right? So you have a twofold attack on God's authority, attacking his message and his revelation, and attacking his ordained means of holding authority, right?
Yeah.
So there's this is, and I think we're seeing those two things in all kinds of ways today. I mean, we're downstream from, let's just say, 100 years of this attack, okay? And I say 100 years, I mean, it's always been going on, but culturally, it's definitely tipped in the last 100 years to being like, we don't even, when I say the word government, the number one thing you think about is the state. 120 years ago, when I said the word government, people would ask which one.
Yeah.
Because they knew that there was such a thing as church government, household government, and civil government. And they were three different forms of government that were essential to maintaining the common good of a whole society. Yeah. And what's happened is that as this all starts with self-government. That's like maybe the fourth one, right? As self-government, meaning we're not obeying God personally. Well, then if I'm a husband not obeying God personally, I'm abdicating my role of authority. Yeah. I'm abusing it, whatever. And then all of a sudden, the government in the household goes down the tubes, right? No one's respects that authority anymore because the husband isn't being faithful. And then after that goes on for long enough, you also have the breakdown of church government. I think that we're living in a culture where we basically like to give the finger to any form of government except for the state. I mean, maybe depending on who you talk to.
Yeah.
But I think that that's symptomatic. When we start to think of government as just being the state, that's symptomatic, and it's actually it's a huge problem.
Yeah.
So when we look at our time and see that we have this huge abuse of power in the state, because like basically if the family government breaks down, if church government breaks down, the state just has this I don't know, it's almost like magnetism to take all the things that are dropped.
Leviathan.
Yeah, it's like Leviathan, and it becomes this nasty, huge thing that just takes over. So if that's the case where we are now, how do we start in fighting that Leviathan?
Yeah.
And I think that if we know that it came from the downstream of giving up in these areas,
for sure,
then the answer is we have to rebuild these things.
Yeah. When we did the sermon on the 10 Commandments, right? And you get to the honor your mother and your father commandment, right?
Yep.
And I remember, I can't remember who I was reading, but I remember somebody was pointing out, I think multiple commentators pointed out, that there's nothing in there about government. There's nothing in there about policemen. There's nothing in there about governors or kings or priests or prophets or anything. And you go, well, why is that? And the reason is that if you don't have a biblical authority in the home, then nothing else matters.
Yep.
Right? And so what happens in the home is the building block for all culture, all society, all forms of government, authority, structure, the whole thing.
Yep.
Everything is. And I think that's why Paul goes there. And if I can add something, hear what you think about this.
Yeah.
Whenever you talk about, you get in conversations with, like I'll have conversations with pastors about females being elders or having female pastors in the church.
Yep.
Or even like order in terms of marriage, right?
Yeah.
And what people want to say is that this isn't a gospel issue, right? And what I want to push back and go, well, what do you mean by it is or it isn't a gospel issue? And when you're reading Ephesians, which reads very similar to Colossians, or you're looking at 1 Timothy 2 and chapter 3, it seems as if Paul is establishing this robust theology of the lordship of Christ and death and resurrection and new life in him. And Paul always takes that camera and he looks at marriage and kids and work. And if by gospel issue you mean the gospel is this ticket that you get into heaven, right? Then you go, okay, well, then order in the family and leadership and gender in the church doesn't really matter.
Which is very similar to that Gnostic notion we talked about in the previous episode.
But if you're talking about Christ as Lord, and he's establishing his kingdom on this earth, and part of that kingdom is a reordering of affairs, a reordering of restoring what was broken and lost in the fall. If Christ is actually establishing his rule over a new people in humanity, and husbands and wives are restored back to God's intention in marriage, then that is a gospel issue, right? Because Paul says Christ is Lord, Ephesians 1-4, and therefore husbands love your wives, and wives submit to your husbands as unto the Lord. Paul doesn't separate. It's because Christ is ruling over this new humanity, and his lordship is what is reordering and reorganizing all of these affairs, and that is husbands, wives, kids, and work situations, right? And it's like, I don't know how to unsee that in Paul's theology, and it seems like when you say this isn't and I know what they're trying to get at when they say it's not a gospel issue, but it's almost like antinomian. Like, okay, we want Jesus to take care of our sins, but we don't want him to order
our lives
in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah, because
does that make sense?
Because if he does that, it's legalism.
That's
right?
legal, yeah.
So it's really interesting the way you came at that through the lordship of Christ. I was thinking about, you were going to go talk about how, Paul talks about how a husband's relationship to his wife is actually supposed to be a demonstration of the gospel. I thought that's where you're going to go, but you went the other direction of, it actually is a demonstration. It actually is the working out of his lordship.
Yes.
And I think that's really insightful, because it connects to this idea that if you give it up, what do you get? You get Leviathan.
Yes.
You get this substitute Lord who ends up, messing up all the lower governments.
Yeah.
So but the marching orders for a husband is to look at Christ and how he loves the church. It's so interesting. It's like how a hologram is like a picture within a picture.
Yes.
It's like the husband's life and love for his wife, and the wife's submission to Christ is a consistent image of the gospel, which also leads to the flourishing, which is the fruit of the lordship of Christ.
Yes.
And so, I don't know how you can say it's not a gospel issue if the gospel is bearing fruit in the world, and if the point of the gospel is Christ is Lord, and he's saving people to himself,
right? And was the order in Genesis 1 and 2, was it right and was it good? Right. And if Christ is about restoring, right, what was lost in sin and in the fall, then there's a clear pattern in Genesis, and it's like, it seems like you're taking this is how I think about it. It seems like you're taking the lordship of Christ and you're removing any implications on any relationship, and you're just saying all you're looking at is Christ has forgiven me and I'm saved.
Yep.
Right? And it's like, but we're praying your kingdom come.
Yeah.
And that kingdom has an order and a structure to it, and assigned roles to gender and into the household. And one of the I think the telltale signs of that is that anytime you mess with God's order, there are consequences.
Yes.
And not just consequences that come on the day of judgment, but there's consequences here and now. And so when Paul says, and he doesn't say it here, but he does say it in Ephesians 5, that the husband is the head of the wife, right? Yeah. Paul doesn't. It's not an imperative.
Yeah, it's
He's not
indicative.
saying husbands strive to be the heads, but he's like, there's something about the way God made men and a husband in marriage and family that the role of the husband or the father will, for good or for bad,
Yeah.
dominate the family.
Yep.
So that when you take a father out of the family and you look at statistically
What that
mental
does.
health, crime, education, drug abuse.
Yeah, it's not just
domestic
the
violence.
family that suffers.
Yeah.
When that happens in a culture, the whole culture suffers.
Yes,
and we're seeing that.
absolutely.
And
Yeah.
it's like you can't look at a single data selection of this and say this isn't one of the roots of all of our societal problems. Is this?
Absolutely.
Is not. You can't.
And politicians won't talk about it.
Yeah. And I think that so fathers, children, but also husbands and wives. So what would you say to the person who hears that word, wives, submit to your husband as is fitting in the Lord, husbands, love your wives, do not be harsh with them? What would you say to the person who hears the word submit and goes, that's misogynistic? What would you say to that person?
I would say, so there are clearly people who have taken this order and these
Yeah.
words and have abused them.
Yes.
Right?
Yep.
But the picture that Paul paints in Philippians 2 is of the son humbling himself,
Yep.
right? And taking on the very nature of a servant, being obedient, even
To death.
point of death on the
Yeah.
cross, right? And we would confess that the Son is equal in glory. He's co-eternal
Yeah.
with the Father,
Yeah.
right? It doesn't. There's no room in our theology to say the Son is somehow less God than the Father.
Yeah.
And yet you clearly see the Son is the one who is submitting and coming, sent to this earth, willfully chooses, embraces that, and suffers and dies. And so if the Son is submitting to the Father, and that is not a denigration to him,
Yeah.
right, then submission cannot mean that the Son is robbed of his dignity or robbed
Yeah.
of his value or robbed of his glory. In fact, it's because the Son lowered himself that the Father has raised him
Yeah.
up and
Yeah.
given him a name that is above all names, that every knee would bow and every tongue would
Yeah.
confess. So I think that's the model that we have, and things that we assume about submission is like, I mean, you can't have any sort of community if you're not willing to submit.
Yeah.
The opposite is narcissism,
Yep.
right? So it's like you have to acknowledge that we are submitting to
Yeah.
one another, and in the gospel we see that submission has nothing to do with
Lowering of status.
having less value
Yeah.
or more value. It's not that
Yeah.
at all.
So in a marriage, if we were to tease out the roles, a husband's job is to take on sacrificial leadership, sacrificial responsibility.
Yes.
Right?
Yep.
He's taking responsibility, and that his role is primarily, I'm going to say, his position is like you said, it's perpetual headship. He's going to dominate.
Yeah.
His presence or lack thereof is going to dominate the family, right? So, and then the wife is responsive to that leadership, and yet there's this direction to submit seems to be like said because there's Paul's giving us direction we need to hear, right? God's giving us through his word direction we need to hear.
Yep.
I think about the garden, we talked about this earlier, but man was prone to abdicating his role, right? And so men need to step it up and be, more active in their roles, in their sacrificial responsibility, and loving their wives. Women need to be responsive to that, support that, respect that. And there's sometimes I wonder if that kind of like we knee jerk against the word submit because we know there's abusive situations. We know that those happen. But the answer to the problem isn't just chuck it's not, that's a perversion of something good. Right? There's a good relationship. So don't chuck the whole God's order for a different perversion, right?
Yes.
Right. So that knee-jerk reaction, I think, to the word submit sometimes is also the very same thing that promotes abdication in men. That makes sense?
Yeah.
it's kind of unpack that a little bit. Like in our egalitarian age, where feminism is rampant, the attitude behind I don't like this idea of submit, we're both equal, has also led to a cultural situation where men actually get a free ride to be easier to abdicate their responsibilities.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
Do you see that?
Which hasn't gone well.
Which hasn't gone. I mean, yes, because it's like it's basically playing into man's temptation.
Yeah.
Right. So so go on. Yeah.
Well, I was gonna say a guy years ago. So I grew up. My dad was a construction worker, and we drove dump trucks. So this made a lot of sense to me because this is absolutely true. Is that he said that men are like dump trucks.
Yeah.
And they're meant to have a load.
Yes.
And if you've ever ridden in a dump truck with a full load of gravel or dirt in it corners way better than an empty dump truck. They actually get squirrely in the corners if they don't have a load.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And he's like, that's how men are built that way. So if you have a load, you're gonna track and corner better than if you don't, right? And there's truth to that. And so there's this appeal that I don't have headship in my family, and so I don't need to be leading, so I don't have this load on me. Mm-hmm. But what you end up doing is you end up spinning your life out, and you end up in the ditch because you were actually meant to have a load. Yep. Right? It's actually good for you to do. And I know we have to go.
Yeah, we have to go. You've
got a meeting.
I think I want to. Do you want to say something?
Well, I was just going to say, I think one of the things when you're talking about submission, and you're talking about this text, and we haven't even talked about kids or slaves and slave masters at all, but the text says that women are to submit to their own husbands, right? Not
as is fitting in the Lord.
To the man, but to your husband. But it doesn't tell the husband to make sure your wife submits to you. Yeah. It tells the husband to love your wife, right? And I think you've got to go after both of those things. Yeah. Like we have to call Christian women to submit to their husbands, but what we're calling Christian men to do is to die.
Yep. I think that if a Christian husband is looking at his family and saying, "Man, I've not led well here," and it's resulted maybe rightly in not rightly, but it's resulted in my wife not respecting me, right? Because I'm not been leading. I've not been leading and taking a sacrificial responsibility. His first thing he needs to do is repent of his abdication. Yes. Repent of his not taking on sacrificial responsibility, and to talk about that with his wife. Yeah. And then to start putting flesh on what that looks like. Yes. And it takes training and learning and
it takes a long time.
Yes, it does. Yep. But a man who is not looking at his own sin and then just looking at his wife's lack of submission and going after that, I'm like, dude, you're looking at the wrong problem. Yeah. You caused this problem. Yeah. Fix what's wrong with you. Yeah. But not to say we don't have our own temptation to not do what God calls us to do. Yeah. So I think we got to go.
Okay, we got to go.
Hey, thanks for joining us. Until next time, trust Christ, love your neighbor, and go to church. Bye.
Yeah.